Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, wrote that, quote, "In France, I had always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom marching in opposite directions. But in America, I found that they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country," quote. That was in 1830. In 2017, it's a rather foreign concept because society, everywhere we look, is telling us that the Constitution, the foundation of our country, advocates for a system of government existing entirely separate from religion and morality. Very few Americans, if they ever knew it all, understand the moral foundation of our country. My dream is to remind those people of where we started. But for a nation so misguided, this is not an easy task. We've been sold the lies for so long that many of us have come to believe that the Constitution is the great separator of church and state. But to explain to you why that isn't true, I only want to inform you of three basic principles of our Constitution. First, what it actually has to say about religion. Second, how it responds to the moral problems of our day. And finally, the very words of the men who wrote our Constitution in the first place. So, what does the Constitution actually say about religion? Well, the First Amendment, which famously promises that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, is where we get the concept of separation of church and state. We commonly interpret their writing to mean that church can't affect government, that law can't be based off morality. But the Heritage Foundation pointed out that when the founders wrote of an establishment of religion, they meant a state religion. Their intent was merely to prevent government from mandating what religion people practiced, as the Church of England had done. It was never to prevent them from practicing their religion in the public sphere. Mark Wall, a professor of politics at George Fox University, analyzed the text of dozens of founding documents and specifically cited the words of the Declaration of Independence and its use of the terms laws of nature and nature's God, divine providence, and creator, and then used this analysis when he concluded that America's founding was, quote, deeply shaped by Christian moral truths, quote. But wait a second. Does that mean that America has to be an expressly Christian nation? It doesn't. And we'll get to that in a second. But for the time being, go along with me. Because those in favor of a secular constitution say, wouldn't us being Christian affect the rights of everyone else? Of course it would. So they present two claims for their side, two reasons why we should relinquish morality in the name of equality. So let's examine the first. And like I promised earlier, to keep things relevant to today's moral problems, let's examine the recent debate over gay marriage. Proponents of it, and those who tolerate it by arguing for its legality, tell us that we must burn our morals on the altar of the Constitution. Because in the name of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we must accept gay marriage as a fundamental right, one established by our Constitution. Morality and Christianity shouldn't play a role in the administration of the laws. After all, they tell us, there's separation of church and state. There's no possible way that I can inflict my sense of right or wrong on anybody else. So goes the first claim against morality in the Constitution, but then the second. After all, society says something like gay marriage doesn't affect my everyday life. Doesn't affect the way I go to work, the way I go to school, the way my grass grows. Thus, why should I care about it? Because it doesn't affect me personally. But this second point is clearly faulty, because only basing law off whether or not it affects us directly just doesn't work in the real world. Because more often than not, moral issues don't affect us directly. For example, let's say that every morning I get up and I notice my neighbor out next door beating his dog. Now, I can clearly view what he's doing as wrong, and there are laws to stop him from doing that, even though what he's doing doesn't affect anyone else directly. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm hardly saying that beating your dog and gay marriage are one and the same thing. They are not one and the same thing. What I'm after here is the general principle that just because something doesn't affect anyone else does not mean it is automatically morally permissible. Because you see, those who condemn someone like that are arguing that what he's doing is morally wrong. But under a standpoint of only outlawing things that affect them directly, they have no basis to to accuse them of any wrongdoing. Their only choice is to argue that there is a higher sense of objective morality that applies to our laws. Because if anything's permissible in the name of tolerance, then how does the Constitution permit any law at all? And right there, we have the answer to the first question we examined, the problem with separation of church and state. Unfortunately, the claim that the founders wanted America to be a Christians-only nation is just not reasonable. In fact, that was their worst fear. In fact, the Constitution bans religious tests for public office. And though the founders did not require that Christianity be practiced as a religion, they most certainly thought it should guide us. That is an undeniable fact of history. Mark Wall wrote, speaking of the founders, quote, "They firmly believed that God ordained moral standards, that legislation should be made in accordance with those standards, and that moral laws take precedence over human laws." Quote. He went on to point out that nearly every Supreme Court justice that was around at the founding publicly proclaimed that if an act of Congress went contrary to moral truth, they would readily strike it down. He went even further than that and examined the historical context of what the founders meant by that famous 7-letter word, liberty. They meant freedom, yes, but they meant the freedom to do what is morally correct. But all you've heard from so far is the Heritage Foundation, a rather conservative law professor, and a 17-year-old speech competitor. Small potatoes compared to the men who actually wrote the document we're so desperately trying to evaluate. So let's look to our founders. John Adams wrote that, quote, "Our Constitution was written only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other." Quote. George Washington said that religion and morality were the essential pillars of society. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, wrote that, quote, "The Bible is the best of all books, for it is the Word of God and teaches us how to be happy in this life and the next. Continue, therefore, to read it and to regulate your life by its precepts." Quote. And to drive the final nail, the Constitutional Convention, the very people who wrote our Constitution in the first place, penned a letter to the states. And they wrote that, quote, "True religion and good morals are the only solid foundations of public liberty and happiness." Quote. Now, all of that tells us two things. First, that law can most certainly be based off people's inner-held moral beliefs, and that there is nothing wrong with using our government as a means to promote those beliefs. Second, it tells us that our founders assumed things would be based that way and realized that if they weren't, the nation would fall. There is simply no way for our government to govern a non-moral people. If morality does not govern us, we can legalize anything we want. Now, if before I started this speech, you already knew everything that I had to say, that's fantastic, and I applaud you for it. But the truth is that most of the American people don't know. Most believe that our Constitution doesn't protect principle, just popularity. So if you were informed, I sincerely ask that you take what I've said to heart. And when you see an American flag waving in the breeze, remember that we are the land of the free. Yes, indeed we are. Remember how far we've come, but don't forget the principles upon which we started.